All right, guys, we're finally here, the Gilded Age. I've been waiting all year. And we're going to dive into really 5 big topics during this time period. The Gilded Age runs chronologically to Reconstruction. It really takes us from 1860 about to 1900, to the turn of the 20th century. And we're going to cover a whole lot of ground culturally and socially, things that we really haven't discussed thus far. And the first one is, now that we're really out of the age of Reconstruction, is the idea of government corruption. And you can see pretty clearly through these political cartoons that are on the screen, corruption is going to be the name of the game during the Gilded Age. It's going to be at the state, local, national level, everything in between, Republicans, Democrats. And we're going to see the heavy exerted influence of the robber barons, right? These economic titans of industry you see here on the bottom right, in determining politics and the course of it throughout the country. Why is it called the Gilded Age, right? Generally speaking, times of American history you would think are called like golden ages, great periods. Gilded, which basically means like it looks nice on the outside, but it's actually like really crappy underneath. The Gilded Age comes from Mark Twain, who later wrote about this period in a not so positive sense. And really, this period is marked by greed, corruption, exploitation, materialism, all of these things that make it a period that really is not so positive. Despite how much I love talking about this period, really not a very positive one. There were some good things that happened, but to be clear, that is important. The United States become an industrial superpower. It'll surpass Great Britain, which up until that time was really running the world economically. We'll expand westward. We'll eliminate the frontier. Frederick Jackson Turner will say in 1890, the frontier has been closed. We'll become a major world power. That's our next chapter, talking about imperialism. And then lastly, we're going to have a huge influx of immigrants that will really diversify the country. The negatives, and there are far more than the ones I'm just going to mention here: corruption, political scandals are going to be ridiculous from the top down, rampant capitalism and exploitation of immigrants, workers, all at the expense of a few getting rich, very, very weak presidents, which I'll talk about in a minute, and really the destruction of Native American life and the forcing of reservations. And there's far more negatives too that we'll talk about, but these are just some of them. So it's a period that has some positives for sure, but generally speaking is looked at pretty negatively in American history. When we look at it from a political perspective, it's the time of Republican dominance. Coming out of Reconstruction, the Democrats will hold the South, right? The solid South, we've talked about that. The rest of the country will be run by the Republicans. Except for 2 terms, they control the White House, Congress. They'll control state governments. City governments are a little bit up in the air, as we'll see. They tend to be held by the Democrats. And it's all effective because of the waving the bloody shirt campaign we talked about last chapter, right? We're going to blame the Democrats for all of our problems. They started the Civil War. They failed Reconstruction. All of these things are results of Democratic initiatives. So the Republicans will dominate and be easily elected. If for some reason they faced opposition from this campaign, they have the money, as we'll see, they're supported by big business to just buy their way into office. And as a result, we get really weak presidents, which you see at the bottom of the screen, starting with Ulysses S. Grant, going all the way to William McKinley at the turn of the 20th century. Very, very weak presidents. There's only one Democrat amongst them, Grover Cleveland, who will be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. But for the most part, these presidents we won't mention because they're just pathetic and they don't do anything. They have no influence. Really coming out of Andrew Johnson, it's basically a 50-year period of weak presidents. The Era of Good Feelings is also known as the Era of Good Stealings. The Gilded Age is also known as the Era of Good Stealings, a play on the Era of Good Feelings. Marred by corruption at all levels, starting from the top down. This is really important. There's 4 big scandals that happened during Grant's administration, which is really the beginning of the Gilded Age, that will set the protocol for that corruption is okay. The first one's the whiskey ring, where whiskey distillers didn't want to pay government taxes, so they instead paid government officials to overlook their failed taxation. And as we're going to see, a lot of these scandals will circle around President Grant. His personal secretary was involved. He was arrested and indicted, but he was never convicted. And we're going to see that really Grant is just known for corruption during his administration. The second one is the Belknap scandal. Secretary of War William Belknap was in charge of Indian reservations, and he accepted bribes from corporations so that they could sell exclusively on Indian reservations. They would sell junk to the Indians for very high prices. He pocketed almost $250,000 himself. The Credit Mobilier scandal, we talked about that in our vocab, really, really famous one. And then the fourth one was the Black Friday scandal. And this is really the one that has major economic ramifications. Jay Gould, who was one of our terms, James Fisk, decide they're going to corner the market on gold. They want to take over the whole gold industry, and they actually pay Grant's brother-in-law to tell Grant not to release gold from Fort Knox. So they're going to buy it all up at a cheap rate so they can sell it at an incredibly high price. And they tell Grant, don't release the gold. Like, we want to corner the market. He will. He winds up doing that, and actually leading to an economic panic. But Gould and Fisk, as we're going to see, are unaffected. Rich people aren't affected by panics and depressions. They stay rich. Grant himself was seen just a few days before this scandal on his yacht with both Gould and Fisk. So while he's never explicitly implicated, corruption was never too far from him. And if it's okay at the presidential level, it must be okay at the local and state levels. And what we get is really the age of the political machine. This is a political group that we really don't see too much anymore in the same fashion, but they would use their influence, their money, whatever necessary, to get their people elected to office so that they could continue to run their legal schemes. And they would use bribes, kickbacks. They would use what's called patronage, right, to make sure that, if you get me 500,000 votes, I'm going to give you a job in the government. I'm going to make sure you keep that job at a really nice salary. So it's all just a means of getting people in power that you want. Rhode Island was the home of this. Nelson M. Aldrich, who many Warwickians hopefully know, Nelson W. Aldrich, excuse me. He was known as the general manager of the United States, Republican senator from Rhode Island, who was in nice and tight with the sugar industry. He kept tariffs very, very high on foreign goods, and as a result, received a number of kickbacks and bribes from those businesses. And in fact, will go on to build Aldrich Mansion, which is right down the road. You see here on the right. It's called the House that Sugar built from all the money he received from the sugar industry. Newport, which is you see down here on the bottom left, which is the Breakers Mansion. This is built by the Vanderbilts, who we'll talk about. Newport becomes the home of the industrialists. And it was said that Mrs. Rockefeller and Mrs. Vanderbilt basically would keep you out of Newport if you didn't have a $5 million net worth. It was only for the rich people. Those were their summer homes. Another great example of Rhode Island corruption is Boss Brayton. Charles R. Brayton was really the home. He was the leader of government corruption in Rhode Island. And you can see at the beginning of this document packet that he pulled the strings in Rhode Island, right? He was the puppeteer. He's a boss in political machines, which means nothing gets done without his okay. He was always in the background, but he was pulling the strings. If anything was going to happen in Rhode Island, he was going to okay it. And we talked about patronage as a very powerful weapon. He himself, Boss Brayton, was the postmaster. He was the postmaster general. He wasn't a front and center politician. Instead, he was pulling strings from the background. And you're going to read this letter right now to see just how much influence he had and how valuable patronage was. All right, so you just read that. It gets you a really good idea of how he was easily able to use his influence to get things done in Rhode Island. Last political cartoon that we're going to talk about regarding Rhode Island is this what Rhode Island's coming to? Like, is this what Rhode Island is, right? That's the commentary in this cartoon here. Brayton with the gavel of justice in one hand and the seat of the Rhode Island Senate, in his hands, and he's accepting all the bribes. If anybody wants anything, come to me. So again, just endemic of how much corruption was really going on in Rhode Island. Even the Providence Journal was involved. We talked about the Rhode Island was a very anti-immigrant, very anti-Catholic state, and the Journal publicly lobbied for know-nothings and Republicans to bar immigrants and the landless poor from being able to vote in Rhode Island. They wanted to be able to restrict voting to basically just the wealthy Republicans. So Rhode Island, huge for corruption, and we'll come back to them later on as well. The most famous example nationally of corruption is the Tweed Ring, Tammany Hall political machine in New York City. Tammany Hall was a building that housed a social group that began way back during the days of Aaron Burr in New York City and came to dominate New York City politics. Very important here. The Tweed Ring and Tammany Hall is democratic political machine. Generally speaking, Republicans dominate the Gilded Age, but we're going to see that the Democrats control a lot of the cities. And they are synonymous with patronage, with corruption, and they'll dominate New York City politics almost up to the 1960s, as we're going to hear in our podcast. The most famous example of the Tammany Hall political machine was William Boss Tweed. He ran New York City for the most part. Basically anything that happened in the city happened because of him. And he was a master of what's called graft. And that's the idea that we're taking funds that are used for public purposes and redistributing them, if you will, to more private interests, what we consider bribes, kickbacks, theft, things like that. The biggest example of that was the New York County Courthouse, which was built during Tweed's administration and cost the city $31 million at the time. And that's because he would overcook the books. For example, he would pay this carpenter $360,000 for a month of work in a room that had very little wood, because only some of it will go to the carpenter. The rest will then go to Tweed, his associates. There's an example here that a plasterer cost almost $130,000. Of course, it didn't all go to him. It went to parts of the criminal organization that was the machine. It's estimated that Tweed cost the city of New York almost $200 million through all of his corruption, bribes, kickbacks, all those things. And we're going to watch 2 videos right now that show that corruption from Gangs of New York. All right, the downfall of Tweed is the cartoon. Thomas Nast, the cartoonist from our vocab, worked for the Harper's Weekly, worked for the New York Times, would publish all sorts of political cartoons that you can see here. And I'm going to have you take a look at each one of them individually in a second. All right, so I like these 2 in particular that I want to talk about. The one on the left, in our video that we just watched, we talked about, Tweed said it doesn't matter how many ballots are counted, it's the people that are doing the counting, right? So he says, in counting, there is strength. That's what the matter. As long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it, right? So as long as Tweed is in power, and don't forget, he's just a state senator. He's a backroom guy. He's going to run everything. Despite the work of Nast, which you can see here in the bottom left, the Tammany Tiger taking over New York City. The tiger was the symbol of Tammany Hall that he would wear on top of his fire engine helmet. Tweed is still going to be able to escape jail. Not even a city prison can hold Tweed. He was arrested, as they talk about in the podcast, kind of humorously, because of the work of Nast. And he famously says, most of my constituents can't read, but oh, those damn pictures. The pictures convince the public of what was really going on and show them what Plunkett will call dishonest graft, right? We talked about that in our document. He's eventually arrested by Samuel Tilden, who we talked about in the last chapter. But as we heard in the podcast, and you saw in that cartoon, he escapes and he goes to Spain. And he's ironically caught because people recognize him from the cartoons that Nast made. He's arrested, he's thrown in jail for the rest of his life, and he'll die in prison with Nast cartoons at his bedside.